Welcome to the Middle Ages. So, let's say you wake up tomorrow morning and instead of grabbing your phone to scroll through memes, you suddenly find yourself in the year 1250. No Wi-Fi, no coffee machine, no Uber Eats, just you, the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of a rooster that is very committed to its alarm clock duties. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Now, when people talk about medieval times, they usually mean the long stretch of history between the fall of the Roman Empire in the West around the 5th century and the beginning of the Renaissance somewhere around the 15th century. That's about 1,000 years of people farming, fighting, praying, and trying really hard not to die from diseases we now treat with one quick trip to the pharmacy. It's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a world of knights in shining armor, fair maidens, and majestic castles. Hollywood has really done a number on us with that image. But the truth, for most people, life was nothing like a fantasy movie. In fact, if you were dropped into a medieval village right now, you'd probably tap out before lunchtime. Let's set the scene. You're standing in a small village. The houses aren't really houses as you know them. They're huts, wooden frames with walls made of wattle and daub, which is basically sticks held together with mud, straw, and, yes, sometimes animal poop. Inside, it's smoky from the fire in the hearth, which doubles as your stove and your heating system. There are no windows, just tiny holes to let the light in, which also let in the cold. And if you're lucky, you might share the space with a couple of goats or chickens, because animals were part of the household. Cozy, right. As for people, most of them were peasants. Around 90% of the population lived and died in small farming communities. They weren't going to jousts, they weren't sipping wine in castles, and they definitely weren't wearing shiny armor. They were wearing rough wool clothes, patched and repatched, while trying to coax crops out of fields that didn't always cooperate. The day started early, like painfully early. Sunlight was the alarm clock, and you didn't dare hit snooze, because every single hour counted. If you wanted bread to eat, you had to farm grain. If you wanted grain, you had to plow the fields. If you wanted plowed fields, you needed to get up before dawn. So yes, sleeping in wasn't really an option. And let's talk about food for a second. You might think, okay, sure, I can handle bread and stew. But medieval bread wasn't exactly fluffy sourdough. It was coarse, hard, and filled with little bits of grit from the grinding stones used to make flour. Chewing it down would slowly sandpaper your teeth. Add to that a lot of cabbage, onions, and maybe some salted fish if you were near water. Meat was rare for peasants, it was expensive, and most of the animals you raised had more value alive for milk, eggs, or wool than on the dinner table. So, no, you wouldn't be feasting like a king. More like surviving on Depression-era chic. Speaking of kings, yes, there were nobles and royalty, but their lives weren't as glamorous as you might think either. Sure, they had more food, more clothing, and bigger houses, but they also lived in drafty stone castles with terrible heating, political backstabbing, and a very high chance of getting killed in some feud over land or power. So while they had more stuff, they weren't exactly chilling in luxury. Now, let's address the elephant, or rather, the horse in the room. Knights. Everyone loves knights. They look cool in movies, charging into battle with lances and swords. But here is the thing, knights were the 1% of their world. Becoming one required noble birth, years of training, and a ton of money for armor, weapons, and horses. The average villager might never even meet a knight in person, let alone become one. For peasants, knights were more like terrifying tax collectors on horseback than heroes in shining armor. And if you were thinking of time travel to the Middle Ages for adventure, let me burst that bubble. Adventure usually meant war, and war meant you were either drafted into someone else's fight or had your village burned down when two lords decided to squabble over borders. Armies didn't politely leave civilians out of it. They raided, pillaged, and took whatever they needed. So unless your idea of fun is losing your only cow to a passing band of soldiers, medieval adventure wasn't great. But maybe you're still clinging to that fantasy of medieval romance. After all, there's something charming about the idea of courtly love, troubadours singing under a lady's window, and secret exchanges of roses. Well, bad news again. For peasants, marriage was less about love and more about survival. Families arranged matches to secure land, labor, or resources. Women married young, often in their teens, and men usually worked 4 years before they could afford to start a family. Noble marriages were even more transactional alliances, power, and property. Love didn't always enter the picture. If you wanted a rom-com, you were out of luck, and we haven't even gotten to hygiene yet. But we'll save that delight for a later chapter. Let's just say that in a world without running water, toothbrushes, or deodorant, your modern nose would not thank you. Spoiler, it smelled bad everywhere. Another thing you'd have to adjust to in the Middle Ages is the way people thought about time itself. Today, we're used to precise schedules. You know exactly when your meeting is, or when your bus arrives. In the Middle Ages, not so much. Clocks existed, but they weren't in every home. Most people just lived by the rhythms of nature, sunrise, sunset, the seasons. Time was fluid, and days blurred together with endless work. If you're used to keeping track of hours, you'd go a little nuts. So, here is the summary. The Middle Ages were tough. The movies might sell you knights, castles, and quests, but the reality was mud, hunger, and back-breaking labor. People endured lives that were harsh and short, with constant risks of famine, war, or disease. And while there were certainly moments of joy, festivals, songs, laughter, life as a whole was about survival first, comfort second. That's why if you, a modern human with modern comforts, were suddenly dropped into the 13th century, you probably wouldn't make it past your first day. Forget slaying dragons, just surviving breakfast would be an achievement. But don't worry, we're just getting started. In the next chapter, we'll take a closer look at what the daily grind really meant for medieval people. Spoiler: it wasn't a cute coffee shop, it was endless farm work. And if you think your job today is hard, well, wait until you see what peasants had to deal with. The daily grind. So, you've survived your first medieval morning. Barely. You woke up on a lumpy straw mattress that smells vaguely like damp hay, smoke, and maybe goat. Your neck hurts, your nose is assaulted, and your stomach is already growling. Welcome to the daily grind of the Middle Ages. Spoiler alert, it's not the kind of grind you can fix with a cappuccino. Life in the medieval countryside was shaped entirely by farming, and I mean entirely. Forget hobbies, forget vacations. If you were a peasant, you were tied to the land like Wi-Fi is tied to your modern happiness. Your entire survival depended on whether your crops grew or failed. And crops aren't very forgiving. They need attention, labor, and a whole lot of luck with the weather. A peasant's day started early, really early. Think the rooster isn't even awake yet early. Sunrise meant it was time to get to work. And there was no such thing as sleeping in. Oversleeping might mean the difference between having bread in winter and staring at an empty bowl. So, you dragged yourself out of bed, rubbed the sleep from your eyes, and went straight to the fields. And don't imagine a picturesque Instagram field of sunflowers or golden wheat swaying gracefully. We're talking muddy, rocky land that had to be plowed by hand or, if you were lucky, with the help of an ox. No tractors, no fertilizers, no shortcuts, just back-breaking labor, day after day. Let's say it's spring, time to plow and sow seeds. You and your neighbors work together, because one person couldn't possibly handle the task alone. You might borrow an ox from a wealthier villager, or your lord, if he was generous. You plow in straight lines, scatter seed, then hope the weather behaves. Too much rain, crops rot. Too little rain, crops shrivel. And if there's a surprise frost, well, good luck. Nature was the boss, and she wasn't a kind one. In summer, the grind shifted to tending crops. You'd weed, mend fences, and keep animals from trampling the fields. Meanwhile, you still had to take care of your own animals, feeding chickens, milking cows or goats, shearing sheep. And then came autumn, harvest time. Everyone, including children, worked from dawn to dusk cutting, gathering, and storing food. Harvest was a frantic race against time and weather. If you didn't bring it all in before the rains, your winter would be bleak. Winter might sound like a break, but don't be fooled. Sure, you weren't plowing fields in snow, but there was still plenty of work. You mended tools, repaired roofs, spun wool into thread, and prayed you had enough food stored to last until spring. Hunger was common, especially in what people called the hungry gap, the stretch before the new harvest when last year's supplies ran low. Imagine trying to get through February on a few crusts of bread and some cabbage stew. Not exactly comfort food. And speaking of food, let's pause here, because the medieval daily grind wasn't just about farming. It was also about eating, or rather, struggling to eat. Bread was the staple, but it wasn't soft and fluffy. It was heavy, dark, and filled with grit from the grinding stones. Imagine chewing sandpaper. Soups and stews were common too, made with whatever vegetables you had: onions, beans, maybe a turnip or two if you were lucky. Meat was rare for peasants, reserved mostly for festivals or stolen bites from the lord's land, which, by the way, could get you in serious trouble if caught. And let's not forget taxes. Oh yes, medieval peasants had to pay rent or dues to their lord, often in the form of crops, animals, or labor. So, after working yourself to exhaustion just to grow enough food for your family, you also had to hand over a chunk of it to your landlord. And on top of that, the church took a tithe, about 10% of your produce. So even if you scraped by, you were always just one bad harvest away from disaster. Now, let's talk about tools. Forget shiny steel plows or ergonomic gardening gloves. Peasants used wooden tools, iron-tipped if they were lucky. Farming was done by brute strength, sweat, and endless repetition. It was physically exhausting, and there was no relief from it. If you hurt your back or broke your hand, too bad, you still had to work, or your family starved. Children weren't spared either. Kids worked from an early age, herding animals, fetching water, collecting firewood. Childhood as we know it today, filled with toys, school, and carefree play, just wasn't a thing. You grew up fast because survival demanded it. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. There were small moments of relief in the grind. People sang while they worked, told stories, and helped each other out. Village life was built on community, and festivals punctuated the year with a bit of joy. Religious holidays, sense days, and seasonal celebrations gave peasants a chance to rest, feast, and socialize. It wasn't luxury, but it was a break from monotony. Still, make no mistake, the daily grind was relentless. From sunrise to sunset, your life revolved around labor. There were no weekends, no paid vacations, no retirement plans. You worked until you physically couldn't anymore. And life expectancy wasn't great. Many people didn't live past their 40s, not because everyone dropped dead at 40, but because disease, famine, and accidents took so many lives young. If you made it to old age, you were tough as nails. So, why wouldn't you last a day in this grind? Well, imagine trading your air-conditioned office or cozy home for a smoky hut, your ergonomic chair for a wooden plough, and your morning latte for ale that tastes suspiciously like pond water. Your hands would blister, your back would ache, and by lunchtime, you'd already be questioning every life decision that led you here. And remember, this wasn't just one hard day. It was every day, over and over. Farming wasn't a hobby or a lifestyle choice, it was survival. Miss a harvest, and you didn't just go hungry, you risked starvation. Fail to pay your dues to the Lord, and you risked losing what little you had. This was the grind that defined medieval life, and it was unforgiving. So, congratulations, you've just worked your first medieval day. You're filthy, exhausted, and your dinner is a bowl of lukewarm cabbage soup. And guess what? Tomorrow, you get to do it all over again, and again, and again. But don't give up yet, we're just getting started. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the food itself. What did people really eat in the Middle Ages? Spoiler, if you thought today's fast food was bad, medieval fast food might actually kill you. Food that will break you, alright. So you've survived your first full day of medieval work. Congrats, you're filthy, sore, and probably wondering what's for dinner. Well, brace yourself, because if you're expecting pizza delivery, chicken nuggets, or even a halfway decent sandwich, medieval food is about to break your spirit. Let's start with the basics. Bread. Bread was life. If you were a peasant, most of your calories came from it. But don't picture a fluffy loaf, fresh from a bakery with a golden crust and warm, soft insides. Medieval bread was dense, heavy, and often full of little surprises like bits of grit and stone dust from the grinding process. Every bite slowly wore down your teeth, which is why archaeologists keep finding medieval skeletons with chompers that look like they lost a fight with a cheese grater. And bread wasn't always wheat, either. Wheat was expensive, and usually reserved for the upper classes. Most peasants ate bread made from rye, barley, or oats, sometimes mixed together into a kind of Frankenstein loaf. If times were really tough, they added peas or beans to stretch the flour further. In short, your bread was filling, but it wasn't winning any Michelin stars. Next up, pottage. Pottage was the medieval version of whatever's in the fridge soup. Basically, you threw vegetables, grains, and maybe a scrap of meat into a pot and let it simmer. Sometimes it was thick like porridge, sometimes thin like soup, and it was what people ate day after day, meal after meal. If you were poor, it was mostly cabbage, onions, and beans. If you were lucky, maybe you got some leeks or turnips. Sound bland. It was. And seasoning was, let's just say, limited. But wait, what about meat? Surely medieval people were all about roast boars and big feasts, right? Well, only if you were a noble. For peasants, meat was a rare luxury. Chickens were too valuable for their eggs, cows for their milk, and pigs for their manure. Killing one for dinner was like smashing your iPhone because you wanted to use the glass as a coaster. It just didn't make sense unless it was a special occasion. That said, peasants did sometimes sneak a rabbit or go fishing, but hunting was often banned by law. Forests were controlled by lords and kings, and poaching could get you fined, beaten, or worse. So unless you wanted to risk your neck for a rabbit stew, you stuck to your veggies. For nobles, though, it was a different story. They held massive feasts with roasted swans, peacocks, venison, and wild boar. They loved showing off with exotic spices like cinnamon, pepper, or ginger, imported from faraway lands. Having spices wasn't just about taste, it was about status. If you could sprinkle pepper on your food, you were basically flexing your medieval wealth. But even the rich didn't escape the problems of food safety. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, and freshness wasn't always guaranteed. Speaking of food safety, let's talk about water. Drinking water in medieval villages was usually a bad idea. Wells could be contaminated with waste, streams were often polluted, and clean water was not easy to guarantee. So, people turned to ale. Yes, even children drank ale. But before you imagine medieval toddlers stumbling around like little drunks, the ale was usually weak, more like liquid bread than beer. It was safer than water, and it gave some calories, too. If you were wealthier, you might drink wine, but good luck affording that as a peasant. And now we get to everyone's favorite medieval problem, famine. If crops failed because of bad weather, pests, or war, food shortages set in fast. When that happened, peasants had to get creative. They might eat acorns, roots, or wild plants. Some records even mention people eating bark, grass in desperate times. If you think kale chips are bad, just imagine chewing on a stick because there's nothing else to eat. Seasonality also shaped what was on the menu. Forget having strawberries in December or avocados year-round. Medieval people ate what they could grow or store. In summer and autumn, there was fresh produce. In winter, it was all about salted, smoked, or dried foods. Meat or fish, if you had any, was preserved in salt barrels or hung over smoky fires. Grains were stored in sacks, but mold and pests often got to them first. Imagine opening your only bag of flour and finding it crawling with weevils. Not exactly appetizing. And here is a fun little detail. Fast days. The church required people to avoid meat on certain days of the week, as well as during Lent and other religious periods. That meant fish became super important. If you lived near a river or coast, maybe you did okay. If not, you were stuck with dried or salted fish that was about as enjoyable as chewing on a salty shoe. Let's not forget dairy. Milk, butter, and cheese were staples, but fresh milk spoiled fast, so most of it was turned into cheese, which could last longer. Medieval cheese wasn't the creamy brie or sharp cheddar you might know today. It was often hard, salty, and sometimes a little questionable. But hey, it was food. Now, if you're imagining dessert to lift your medieval spirits, sorry. Sugar was rare and expensive, more of a medicine than a treat. Peasants sometimes had honey, but most desserts were simple, fruit in season, maybe a basic cake if you had flour and eggs. Nobles, of course, had fancier sweets, but even those would probably disappoint your modern sweet tooth. So why wouldn't you last a day on medieval food? Well, for starters, your stomach isn't used to it. Heavy bread, endless cabbage, and questionable ale would have you running to the nearest outhouse if there even was one. Your taste buds would also revolt. No spices, little variety, and the constant fear that your food might make you sick. And if you were dreaming of a midnight snack, forget it. The pantry was probably empty, and there was no fridge to raid. But maybe the hardest part to imagine is how central food was to survival. Today, if your fridge is empty, you just go to the store. In the Middle Ages, there was no safety net. If the harvest failed, you starved. If war swept through, your supplies were stolen. Every meal was a reminder of how fragile life was. So, enjoy your modern pizza, because in the medieval world, dinner was more like a battle and you weren't always sure you'd win. Next time, we'll get into something even worse than bland bread and cabbage stew. The smell. Spoiler alert, it wasn't good at all. The smell of the Middle Ages. So, you've worked the fields, eaten your gritty bread, and settled in for another day of medieval life. There's just one problem: you can't breathe. That's because the Middle Ages didn't exactly smell like lavender candles and freshly baked cookies. It smelled, well, bad. Really bad. Let's start with the streets. Imagine walking through a medieval village. The roads aren't paved, they're dirt or mud, depending on the weather. And that mud, it's not just mud. Animals walked those streets all day long: cows, pigs, chickens, horses, and they left behind little gifts. Without a sanitation department, those gifts just stayed there, piling up. Add rain, and the whole road turns into a foul-smelling stew. You didn't so much walk through town as you waded through a mixture of muck, manure, and mystery liquids. And then there's waste. Human waste. Chamber pots were the medieval version of toilets, basically a bucket under the bed. In the morning, you or some unlucky child would empty it out into the street or a cesspit. If you lived in a city, waste disposal was even worse. In some towns, people literally shouted "Gardilou" out the window before dumping their chamber pots into the street below. You'd better hope you weren't walking by at the wrong time. So, watch your step wasn't just good advice, it was survival. Bathing, that was another issue. Contrary to the myth, medieval people did bathe, but not often. Heating water took effort, and tubs weren't common in peasant homes. Some people visited public bathhouses, but those places gained a reputation for being less about hygiene and more about, let's say, extracurricular activities. As a result, the church frowned on them, and they declined in popularity. So, for the average villager, bathing might mean splashing your face with cold water once in a while. Whole body baths were rare. That meant most people carried around a certain aroma. Think sweat, smoke from the hearth, animal odors, and unwashed wool clothing. If you lived in a one-room hut with your family and a couple of goats, well, let's just say no amount of incense could cover that up. Deodorant, not invented yet. Perfume, that was for the rich, and it usually smelled like strong herbs rather than flowers. Clothing added to the problem. Peasants wore the same outfit day after day, patched until it was more holes than fabric. Washing clothes was a huge chore. involving hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing garments with harsh lye soap, and hanging them to dry. So, laundry day didn't happen very often. You just wore your smelly tunic until it practically walked away on its own. Now, let's add livestock to the mix. Animals weren't kept in tidy barns out back. Often, they lived in the same building as people, especially in peasant huts. Chickens scratched on the floor, pigs rooted in the corner, cows chewed cud nearby. The idea was that their body heat kept the hut warmer in winter, which, okay, makes sense, but it also meant your living room smelled like a barnyard 24/7. And we can't forget disease. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs were everywhere. People rarely washed their bedding, so vermin thrived. You'd scratch constantly, spreading more dirt and infection. Combine that with the fact that most people's teeth were rotting from gritty bread, and mouths didn't smell too fresh either. Imagine a room full of people talking, all with bad breath and itchy scalps. Yeah, not exactly pleasant. But the real olfactory nightmare was medieval cities. Let's take London, Paris, or any other growing town of the time. Picture thousands of people crammed into narrow streets, with animals, chamber pots, and refuse piling up. Butchers threw animal guts into alleys. Tanneries, where leather was processed, used urine in their work, and the smell was overwhelming. Open sewers ran down the middle of streets, carrying away waste, but not fast enough to keep the stench at bay. Visitors often commented on how foul medieval cities smelled, and if you lived there, you just got used to it. For nobles, things weren't much better. Sure, they had stone castles instead of mud huts, but castles weren't exactly fragrant. Drafty halls smelled of smoke from torches and fireplaces, mixed with the odor of hundreds of people, animals in the stables, and food cooking in kitchens without ventilation. Add in the fact that castle toilets, or guardrobes, were basically holes in the wall leading to cesspits below, and, well, let's just say the smell drifted a lot. Medieval medicine even tied smells to health. Doctors believed that bad air or miasma spread disease. So, during outbreaks, like the plague, people carried posies of herbs or wore masks filled with sweet-smelling plants to try to protect themselves. It didn't really work, but at least it made things smell slightly less awful. Now, you might be thinking, okay, maybe I could tough it out. Smell is just smell, right? But here is the thing, the human brain gets overwhelmed by constant odor. It would affect your appetite, your sleep, your mood. Imagine trying to fall asleep in a room that smells like smoke, sweat, manure, and mold, with fleas biting at your ankles. You'd be awake all night, nose buried in your sleeve, wondering why you ever left the 21st century. And let's be honest, your modern nose isn't built for it. You're used to showers, laundry detergent, toothpaste, air fresheners, and trash collection. Medieval people didn't notice the smell as much because it was normal to them. For you, you'd be gagging before breakfast. So why wouldn't you last a day in the medieval world of smells? Because every breath would remind you that hygiene, sanitation, and deodorant are modern miracles. You dream of clean sheets, minty toothpaste, and hot showers. And without them, you'd probably give up time travel altogether. The funny thing is, despite all the stink, people still laughed, loved, and carried on. Humans adapt, and medieval folks just accepted the odor of life as part of the deal. But for you, dear modern traveler, it would be the quickest way to run screaming back to the present. Next time, we'll move from smells to style. Spoiler, medieval fashion was less about looking good and more about surviving the weather. Forget comfy hoodies, it's all scratchy wool and itchy underwear. Dress to depress, all right. So you've survived the sights, the sounds, and especially the smells of the Middle Ages. But now it's time to talk about clothes. And let me tell you, you're not going to find any comfy hoodies, soft cotton t-shirts, or stretchy sweatpants here. In fact, if you care about fashion, or even just basic comfort, medieval clothing might break your spirit. Let's start with the material. Forget cotton for a moment. While it existed, it was rare and expensive in most of medieval Europe. The fabric of choice for peasants was wool, and not the nice, soft merino wool you buy today. We're talking rough, scratchy, sometimes greasy stuff that could make your skin itch just by looking at it. Linen was also common, especially for undergarments, but it was still a far cry from modern fabric. Basically, if you were a peasant, your wardrobe was made up of scratchy tunics, scratchy trousers, and scratchy cloaks. Notice the theme, scratchy. Now, fashion wasn't really about self-expression for most people. It was about practicality and survival. Your tunic wasn't designed to make you look snatched in your selfies. It was designed to keep you warm while plowing fields. Clothes were homemade, patched over, and often handed down. Some outfits were worn until they literally fell apart. If you think you've been wearing the same jeans too often, medieval peasants wore the same tunic every single day until it was more holes than cloth. And let's not even get started on underwear. Yes, medieval people wore undergarments, but don't imagine anything sleek or supportive. Men wore bries, which were like baggy linen shorts tied with a string. Women wore a shift, basically a long linen shirt. Socks. If you were lucky, you had cloth wraps or stockings, but don't expect cozy elastic. Everything was loose, bulky, and prone to sliding around at the worst times. In short, medieval underwear was not winning any comfort awards. Shoes weren't much better. Peasants usually wore leather-turned shoes, soft, flat, and not very durable. They didn't have thick sole or arch support. Imagine walking across rocky, muddy ground in slippers that wear out after a few months. If you had money, you might get sturdier boots, but most peasants went through shoes like modern people go through cheap earbuds. Some even went barefoot in summer, because it was easier than wearing falling apart shoes. Now, for the wealthy, clothing was fancier, but not necessarily comfier. Nobles wore brightly dyed fabrics, trimmed with fur, and tailored to show status. Rich colors like purple, crimson, and deep blue were expensive, since the dyes came from rare plants, minerals, or even insects. If you could strut around in a robe of scarlet wool lined with ermine fur, people knew you had serious coin. But the downside, those outfits were heavy, hot, and still pretty scratchy. Imagine sweating under layers of wool and fur in summer, all because you wanted to show off. And here is where it gets worse: sumptuary laws. These were actual laws that dictated what you could and couldn't wear, based on your social class. The idea was to keep peasants from dressing above their station. For example, certain furs or fabrics were reserved only for nobles. If a peasant tried to wear them, they could get fined or punished. In other words, even if you somehow managed to snag a stylish outfit, you might get in trouble just for wearing it. So much for fashion freedom. Hair and headwear were another big deal. Peasants often wore simple wool or linen hoods to protect from weather, while nobles sported elaborate hats or veils. Women, in particular, were expected to cover their hair once they were married, often with wimples, cloth wrapped around the head and neck, or veils. Noble women sometimes balanced crazy cone-shaped hennins on their heads, the tall pointy hats you see in fairy tales. They look dramatic, sure, but try fitting through a doorway in one. And hygiene made clothing even less glamorous. Remember, laundry was hard work. Clothes weren't washed often, and undergarments soaked up sweat and grime until they practically had personalities of their own. A noble might own several outfits, but a peasant probably had one good set of clothes for daily use and maybe another for special occasions. If those got dirty, tough luck, you wore them anyway. Now, let's add climate into the mix. Medieval Europe could be cold, damp, and miserable, especially during winters. Without modern insulation or heating, your clothes were your main defense against the elements. That meant layers upon layers of wool cloaks, shawls, and hoods. You might look like a lumpy bundle of fabric, but at least you wouldn't freeze. Comfort wasn't the goal, survival was. Of course, nobles took things to extremes. In later medieval times, men's tunics got shorter, tighter, and sometimes ridiculous. Pointy shoes became a fashion craze, with the tips so long they had to be tied to the knees to keep from tripping. Women's gowns had sleeves that dragged on the floor, collecting mud and whatever else was lying around. Fashion was a statement, but practicality went out the window. So, why wouldn't you last a day in medieval clothing? Well, picture this. You wake up, slip into a scratchy wool tunic, tie on some baggy bries, and shove your feet into floppy leather shoes. By mid-morning, you're itchy, sweaty, and tripping over your cloak while trying to haul water from the well. Your outfit is heavy in the rain, freezing in the wind, and impossible to keep clean. Forget Instagram-worthy fashion, this is survival gear. And it's not pretty. The irony is that medieval people probably didn't think much about comfort the way we do. Clothes were just clothes, functional, durable, and good enough to keep you alive. But for you, used to soft fabrics, sneakers with cushioning, and washing machines, it would feel like a punishment. So next time you pull on your favorite hoodie or slip into stretchy yoga pants, take a moment to thank the centuries of textile innovation that separate you from scratchy wool and saggy linen underwear. Because in the Middle Ages, getting dressed was less about style and more about tolerating constant discomfort. But hey, at least once you were dressed, you were ready for anything. Farm work, a sudden rainstorm, or even a surprise visit from your lord demanding taxes. Fashion wasn't about making a statement, it was about being ready to survive the chaos of medieval life. And speaking of chaos, what happened if you got sick? Spoiler, you definitely didn't want to. In the next chapter, we'll explore the wonderful, terrifying world of medieval medicine. Get ready for leeches, charms, and treatments that might make you long for webmed. Medieval medicine, good luck. So, you've made it through the scratchy clothes, the questionable food, and the unbearable smells of medieval life. Congratulations, you're alive. For now. But here comes the bad news. In the Middle Ages, if you got sick, the cure was often worse than the illness. Medicine back then was a wild mix of superstition, trial and error, and a whole lot of wishful thinking. Honestly, you'd have better luck asking a magic 8-ball for a health advice. Let's start with the basics. Medieval medicine was based heavily on something called the four humours. According to this ancient theory, your body was made up of four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If those got out of balance, you got sick. Feeling feverish, too much yellow bile. Depressed, that's excess black bile. Sneezing a lot, clearly too much phlegm. The treatment: adjust the balance, usually by draining, purging, or making you throw up. Not exactly cutting-edge science. The most infamous treatment was bloodletting. Doctors, or sometimes just the local barber, yes, your barber, would use knives, leeches, or sharp instruments to drain your blood. The idea was that it balanced your humours. In reality, it just made you weaker and more likely to pass out. Imagine going to the doctor for a headache, and they say, "No worries, we'll just let out a pint of blood." Congratulations. Now you have both a headache and anemia. Speaking of barbers, they weren't just there to give you a medieval buzz cut. The red and white barber pole you see today actually comes from this tradition: red for blood, white for bandages. That cheerful candy cane pole was basically an advertisement for, come in, we'll cut your hair, pull your teeth, and maybe drain your blood while we're at it. Efficiency at its finest. Herbal remedies were another big part of medieval medicine. People used plants like sage, rosemary, garlic, and willow bark to treat various ailments. Some of these actually worked. Willow bark, for example, contains a chemical similar to aspirin, but others were a little more questionable. For instance, rubbing a live chicken on a bubonic plague sore was considered a treatment. Spoiler: it did not cure the plague. It just made the chicken very unhappy. Astrology also played a huge role in diagnosing and treating illnesses. Doctors often consulted the stars before performing procedures. The position of the moon or planets could determine whether it was a good day to let out blood or give you a certain potion. So yes, your horoscope might not just tell you about your love life, it might decide whether you live through surgery. And speaking of surgery, brace yourself. Medieval surgery was brutal. There were no anesthetics, no antiseptics, and definitely no sterile instruments. If you needed a limb amputated, you were strapped down while the surgeon hacked it off with a saw. The only pain relief was maybe a strong drink or someone hitting you over the head. Survival rates were, let's just say, not great. Infections were almost guaranteed, since nobody knew about germs. If you didn't bleed out on the table, you might die a week later from sepsis. Dentistry wasn't much better. If you had a rotten tooth, the solution was simple: yank it out. No numbing, no gentle tools, just brute force with pliers or even bare hands. People feared medieval dentistry almost as much as the diseases themselves. Imagine dreading the toothache, but dreading the dentist more. Now, not everyone could afford a trained physician. Most people relied on local healers, wise women, or monks. Monasteries often had herb gardens and medical texts, making monks some of the more reliable practitioners. But outside the monastery walls, treatments often blurred the line between medicine and magic. Amulets, charms, and prayers were commonly prescribed. A sore throat, wear a necklace of dried toad. A fever, sleep with a piece of iron under your pillow. Did it work? Probably not, but at least you felt like you were doing something. Plagues and epidemics really showed how little medieval medicine could do. The Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing millions. Doctors wore those now famous beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing the scent would protect them from bad air. It didn't. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to strange ointments, none of which worked. People died in droves, while doctors shrugged and blamed the stars. Childbirth was another dangerous area. Women faced incredibly high risks giving birth, with little to no medical help beyond midwives and herbal remedies. Complications like infections or breech births often meant death for the mother, the child, or both. For all the progress humans had made by the Middle Ages, bringing new life into the world was still one of the deadliest experiences. And let's not forget mental health. Depression, anxiety, or other mental illnesses weren't understood at all. They were often blamed on demonic possession, sin, or weak character. Treatments could be cruel exorcisms, confinement, or even punishment. Imagine going through modern burnout and your boss calling for a priest instead of a therapist. Now, before we dunk too hard on medieval medicine, it's worth noting that it wasn't all useless. Some herbal treatments did help. Monks preserved ancient medical knowledge and experimented with new remedies. Over centuries, medical universities began forming, and surgery slowly became more professional. But compared to what we have today, antibiotics, painkillers, vaccines, it was terrifyingly primitive. So why wouldn't you last a day with medieval medicine? Because even a minor illness could spiral into a death sentence. A cut on your hand could get infected and kill you. A stomachache might lead to bloodletting that made things worse. And if you broke a bone, well, good luck walking again. The odds were never in your favor. The irony is that medieval people didn't see themselves as backward. They thought they were practicing the best medicine available, based on ancient wisdom and divine order. And in some ways, they were doing the best they could with what they had. But from your modern perspective, where even a headache gets solved with ibuprofen, medieval medicine would feel like torture disguised as treatment. So next time you pop an Advil or get antibiotics from the pharmacy, just remember your ancestors might have gotten a leech instead. And let's be honest, you wouldn't last long in a world where your doctor's motto was basically, let's just bleed it out and hope for the best. Now, speaking of hopeless situations, let's move on to one of the biggest killers of the Middle Ages, disease itself. Because if the medicine didn't get you, the plague probably would. The joy of disease. If you thought medieval medicine was bad, wait until you meet its best friend, disease. In the Middle Ages, sickness wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant part of life. It lurked in the water, in the air, in your food, and probably even in your scratchy wool tunic. And the scariest part, nobody knew why people got sick. They blamed bad air, angry gods, sinful behavior, or the wrong stars being in the sky. Germs, bacteria, viruses, nope. Those ideas were hundreds of years away. Let's start with the big one, the Black Death. In the mid-1300s, this bubonic plague tore across Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Whole villages vanished. Families were wiped out overnight. People developed black swellings called buboes, got raging fevers, and usually died within a few days. It spread so fast that bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. And here is the thing, nobody knew what caused it. They thought it was bad smells in the air, so doctors stuffed herbs in their beak masks. Some thought it was punishment from God, so they whipped themselves in the streets to show repentance. Meanwhile, the real culprit fleas on rats went about their business, turning Europe into a disaster zone. But the Black Death wasn't the only nightmare. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and leprosy were common too. Smallpox left people scarred for life, if they survived at all. Measles could sweep through children like wildfire, and leprosy was especially feared, since it caused visible sores and disfigurements. Lepers were often cast out of towns, forced to live in colonies, and made to carry bells to warn others they were nearby. Imagine being sick and rejected at the same time. Talk about adding insult to injury. And then there was dysentery, or what we'd politely call the runs. With no clean water and bad sanitation, intestinal diseases spread constantly. Drinking air was often safer than drinking water, because at least it was boiled during brewing. Still, stomach bugs were part of daily life. A bad case of food poisoning today is unpleasant. In the Middle Ages, it could kill you. Childhood was especially dangerous. Roughly 1 in 3 children didn't survive past age 5. Fevers, infections, and malnutrition cut lives short before they could even begin. Parents often didn't name their babies until after the first year, because the odds of survival were so low. Imagine living in a world where losing a child was considered normal. Even injuries could turn fatal. A small cut while farming, a burn from the hearth, or a broken bone could easily get infected. Without antibiotics, infections spread fast, blood poisoning set in, and before you knew it, you were gone. Medieval people didn't need catastrophic accidents to die every day. Mishaps were risky enough. Now, diseases weren't just medical problems, they were social ones too. Many were blamed on morality, sin, or even witchcraft. If you fell ill, some people might think you'd angered God or been cursed. Entire groups, like Jews or foreigners, were sometimes scapegoated during outbreaks, leading to horrific persecution. So not only were you sick, but you could also be accused of causing the sickness. On the flip side, disease shaped society in strange ways. The Black Death, for example, killed so many peasants that suddenly there weren't enough workers to farm fields or build castles. That gave survivors more bargaining power. They could demand better wages and conditions. In a twisted way, plague actually helped shake up the feudal system. Death brought opportunity. Talk about silver linings. But let's be real. Day to day, disease was terrifying. Imagine waking up with a fever, and instead of calling a doctor or taking medicine, your family starts panicking that the village priest needs to be summoned. Your neighbor might suggest bloodletting. Your cousin might bring a charm blessed by a monk. And you're just lying there, hoping it's not the start of something that could wipe out your entire household. What's worse is that people didn't know how to stop diseases from spreading. Quarantines existed, but not always effectively. Whole cities might close their gates, but fleas and rats didn't care about walls. Washing hands wasn't a thing. In fact, bathing too often was sometimes discouraged, since people thought it opened your pores to bad air. So instead of preventing disease, they accidentally made things worse. And then there were epidemics that just kept coming back. The plague didn't show up once and leave, it returned again and again in waves over centuries. Just when people thought they were safe, another outbreak would roll through. Life in the Middle Ages meant constantly looking over your shoulder for the next invisible killer. So why wouldn't you last a day? Because you're used to living in a world where you can grab Tylenol, see a doctor, or rely on vaccines to keep you safe. In medieval times, every cough, sneeze, or stomachache carried a hint of doom. You'd be paranoid in no time, jumping at every sniffle like it was the start of the apocalypse. The strange part is that medieval people, as much as they feared disease, just accepted it as part of life. Death was everywhere, in homes, in villages, in cities. Cemeteries filled up so quickly during plagues that mass graves became common. Priests were overwhelmed, burial rites rushed. In some towns, people just left bodies in the streets, too afraid to touch them. For modern people, it's hard to even imagine that level of daily loss, but for medieval folks, it was their normal. And that's the real kicker: you wouldn't just be physically crushed by disease, but emotionally as well. Living with constant death and fear would wear you down faster than any fever. So, the joy of disease, there really wasn't any, unless you count the fact that some survivors got to inherit land, money, or jobs when others died. But for most, it was just pain, fear, and loss. And if you think your immune system is tough enough to survive, just remember, you wouldn't even make it past the first winter flu season. Now, speaking of winters, let's take a look at where medieval people actually lived and why their homes weren't much of a refuge from the chaos outside. Get ready for smoky huts, freezing castles, and the joy of sharing space with your livestock. Homes that weren't sweet, if you're imagining medieval homes as warm, rustic cottages with crackling fireplaces and cozy wooden beams. I've got some bad news. Medieval housing wasn't sweet, it was smoky, cramped, cold, and often smelled worse inside than outside. Forget Pinterest-worthy medieval vibes. Your dream home would look more like a survival bunker built out of mud and desperation. Let's start with the peasants, because most people were peasants. Their homes were usually simple huts made of wood, wattle and daub, that sticks woven together and covered with mud, or sometimes just stone, if they were lucky. The roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, which might sound quaint until you realize they were basically fire hazards and rat condos. That's right, your ceiling could literally be alive with squeaking, scratching tenants who didn't pay rent. Inside, the layout was simple, and by simple, I mean one room, maybe two if you were fancy. This single space was used for cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. Privacy, forget it. Whole families, sometimes with grandparents, kids, and even farmhands, all crammed together. And if that wasn't enough, the animals often lived indoors too. Chickens, goats, or even a cow might share your living space, especially in winter. Think of it as a medieval version of central heating, except the heat source moved, pooped, and occasionally kicked over your water bucket. The floor was usually dirt, not rustic dirt or earthy chic, just plain dirt. Some people spread straw or rushes across it to make things less muddy, but those rushes quickly turned into a soggy, moldy mess. Imagine a medieval carpet made of wet hay that never got cleaned. People would just pile fresh straw on top of the old, creating layers of filth. Sometimes herbs were mixed in to cover the smell, but let's be honest, mint and lavender can only do so much against pig stink. As for furniture, don't picture IKEA. A peasant's house might have a table, a few stools, maybe a bench, and some crude chests for storage. Beds were often straw mattresses stuffed into sacks, lumpy, smelly, and home to insects. If you've ever complained about hotel pillows being too flat, just imagine sleeping on a sack of bugs and straw. Oh, and blankets were heavy wool or animal skins. Toasty, sure, but also itchy and sometimes damp. Now let's talk about the air quality. Medieval homes were basically smoke machines. The fire pit, used for cooking and heat, was often in the middle of the room with no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let out the smoke. Except the hole didn't really do the job. Smoke filled the room, clinging to your clothes, your hair, your lungs. People's eyes watered constantly, and coughs were common. On the plus side, all that smoke did help preserve meat hanging from the rafters. On the minus side, you were basically marinating yourself like a ham. Okay, so peasant huts sound rough. But what about castles? Surely the nobility lived in comfort, right? Well, not exactly. Castles were impressive fortresses, but as homes, they were cold, dark, and drafty. Thick stone walls kept enemies out, but they also kept heat out. Fireplaces helped a little, but unless you were sitting right in front of one, you were freezing. In winter, nobles often wore multiple layers of fur and cloaks indoors, just to stay warm. Forget cozy castles were like living inside a refrigerator. Lighting wasn't great either. Windows were small, sometimes covered with oiled cloth or thin slices of hon instead of glass. That meant rooms were dim and gloomy. Torches and candles provided light, but also more smoke and soot. And don't think of beeswax candles filling the air with sweet honey smells. Those were expensive. Most people used tallow candles made from animal fat, which stank like burning bacon grease. Furniture in castles was fancier than in huts, but still not comfy by modern standards. Heavy wooden tables, stiff chairs, and beds that were more about status than rest. Some nobles did have elaborate canopied beds with curtains, which at least kept out drafts and bugs. But soft mattresses and fluffy pillows, not yet. You'd still be lying on straw or, if you were lucky, a lumpy feather bed. Cleanliness inside homes was a whole other issue. Without proper sanitation, waste disposal was primitive. Chamber pots were used indoors, then emptied into the street or moat. Floors were rarely scrubbed. Vermin like fleas, lice, and mice were everywhere. Basically, if you think your messy apartment is bad, just be glad you don't share it with a pig, a smoky fire, and a bucket of waste in the corner. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone try to make their homes nicer? Yes, to some extent. People decorated with herbs, tapestries, or religious symbols. Nobles especially liked colorful wall hangings to cover cold stone walls. These not only looked nice, but also helped trap a little warmth. Still, no amount of tapestry can make up for icy drafts whistling through arrow slits. It's worth mentioning that homes did vary depending on where you lived. A peasant in northern Europe might huddle in a thatched hut, while someone in a Mediterranean village might have a simple stone house with a tiled roof. But no matter where you were, the idea of a cozy, insulated, pest-free home just didn't exist. So why wouldn't you last a day in a medieval home? Because you're used to climate control, fluffy bedding, and pest-free living. Imagine waking up with smoke in your lungs, fleas in your sheets, and a chicken sitting on your face. Your bedroom is also your kitchen, your barn, and your bathroom. And if you're a noble, the alternative is freezing in a stone box that echoes with every draft. The truth is, medieval people didn't expect comfort from their homes. A roof over your head, walls to keep out the wind, and a fire to cook food that was enough. For you, though, the constant smoke, stink, and damp would feel unbearable. You'd be begging for your modern bed and central heating after one night. So next time you light a scented candle, fluff your pillow, or complain about your noisy upstairs neighbor, just remember at least your neighbor isn't a cow, and your ceiling isn't literally alive with rats. Now that we've settled into these less than cozy homes, it's time to think about how medieval people entertained themselves when they weren't freezing or coughing up smoke. Spoiler, it wasn't Netflix. Let's head into the surprisingly strange world of medieval fun, entertainment, medieval style, alright. We've trudged through smoky huts, survived plagues, and even tolerated medieval underwear. So, you might be wondering, did medieval people ever have fun? Or was life just endless farm work, scratching fleas, and dodging death? Well, believe it or not, people did entertain themselves. They laughed, played, sang, and even partied. But compared to your modern options, streaming, gaming, scrolling TikTok for 3 hours straight, medieval entertainment might feel, let's just say, underwhelming. Let's start with the basics. Music and storytelling. Without television, radio, or Spotify, music was performed live. Peasants sang while working, told stories by the fire, and passed tales down orally. Wandering minstrels, bards, or jongleurs would travel from village to village, bringing songs and news. Picture them as the medieval version of your favorite podcast, except instead of being in your earbuds, they were standing in front of you with a lute. Dancing was also popular, especially at festivals or after the harvest. These weren't choreographed TikTok routines, but simple circle dances or line dances everyone could join in. No matter how clumsy you were, you could take part, though someone might still laugh at your left feet. Speaking of festivals, Those were the real highlights of the year. Religious feasts, saints' days, and seasonal events gave peasants a break from daily grind. Fairs would pop up with merchants, games, entertainers, and of course, food. Imagine a cross between a church holiday and a county fair. There might be jugglers, fire breathers, puppet shows, or even trained animals performing tricks. For a peasant who spent most of the year shoveling muck, this was a big deal. Games were another source of fun. People played simple board games like Nine Men's Morris or backgammon. Dice and gambling were hugely popular, even though the church frowned on it. Children played with wooden toys, balls, or hoops. Wrestling, archery contests, and foot races entertained both kids and adults. And then there were rougher games, like mob football, a chaotic ancestor of soccer that involved entire villages chasing a ball or sometimes a pig's bladder through fields, rivers, and streets. Injuries were common, but hey, it was tradition. Now, if you were wealthy, you had access to bigger, flashier entertainment. Nobles attended tournaments, where knights showed off their skills in jousting or melee battles. Picture men in armor charging at each other with lances, while crowds cheered. For spectators, it was thrilling like a medieval action movie, live and uncut. For the knights, though, it was dangerous. Injuries and deaths weren't uncommon, but bragging rights and glory were worth the risk. Hunting was another pastime for nobles. It wasn't just about food, it was about sport, status, and showing off. Deer, boar, and falcons were all fair game. Speaking of falcons, falconry was a luxury hobby. Training a bird of prey to catch food for you. That was peak noble flex. Storytelling wasn't just for peasants, either. Nobles enjoyed courtly romances, epic tales of knights and chivalry, and poetry recited by troubadours. Think of it as their Netflix binge, but instead of watching a season in one sitting, you listened to a bard sing 4 hours. Cliffhangers were a thing too. Stories might end mid-adventure, leaving you waiting for the next installment. Imagine medieval Game of Thrones, only sung in rhyme. Now, let's not pretend everything was wholesome fun. A lot of medieval entertainment was rough or even brutal. Animal baiting, for example, was popular, chaining a bear or bull and setting dogs on it while crowds watched. Public executions also drew massive audiences. It's grim, but in a world with limited options, watching justice served medieval style was considered a social event. It's like people thought, hey, we don't have Netflix, but we do have a hanging today. Even with these darker sides, entertainment mattered. Festivals and games broke up the monotony of work. Music and stories gave people hope, laughter, and connection. Imagine living in a smoky hut with a dirt floor. Then suddenly, for one day, there's music, dancing, food, and games. It must have felt magical. But here is why you wouldn't last a day with medieval entertainment. Boredom. You're used to constant stimulation: TV, social media, video games, movies on demand. In the Middle Ages, days were long and fun was occasional. After the harvest festival ended, you'd go back 2 months of hard labor and silence. Your brain, wired for endless scrolling, would feel starved. And even when you did find entertainment, it came with discomfort. Watching a tournament meant standing outside in the cold. Dancing at a fair meant stomping around in mud. Listening to a bard meant sitting on a hard bench 4 hours. No comfy couch, no surround sound, no snack bar. Just raw, medieval vibes. To be fair, medieval people didn't know what they were missing. For them, a puppet show or a dice game was enough to brighten the day. But for you, let's be honest, you'd probably last 10 minutes before whining about the lack of Wi-Fi. So, entertainment existed in the Middle Ages. It was simple, sometimes brutal, but it kept people going. It gave them joy of a world where death and hardship were constant. And maybe, just maybe, if you squint hard enough, you'd find yourself enjoying a jug of ale, a silly dance, or a story told by firelight. Still, don't get too comfortable, because, while medieval fun could be wholesome, the justice system definitely wasn't. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at crime and punishment in the Middle Ages, where even stealing a loaf of bread could get you more than just a slap on the wrist. Medieval justice spoiler. It's brutal, all right. We've danced at the village fair, clapped 4 nights jousting, and maybe even placed a bet on mob football without getting trampled. But now it's time to talk about what happened when someone broke the rules in medieval times. Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. If you think getting grounded by your parents was harsh, medieval justice will make you thankful for every boring lecture you ever sat through. First thing to know, there was no such thing as a fair trial the way we understand it today. Forget lawyers, jury duty, or appeals. Justice in the Middle Ages was a mix of local customs, church law, and whatever your local lord felt like enforcing that day. The result? Punishments that were quick, public, and usually painful. Let's start with the simple stuff. If you stole something small, say a loaf of bread, you might be whipped in the village square or forced to spend time in the stocks. Stocks were wooden boards with holes where your hands and head stuck through. You'd be left there for hours or even days, while villagers threw rotten food, mud, or worse at you. Imagine your neighbors walking by, laughing at you, and maybe hurling a cabbage. Medieval justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about public humiliation. But if the crime was bigger, things escalated fast. Thieves who were caught repeatedly could lose a hand. Counterfeiters might have an ear cut off. And if you were unlucky enough to be accused of treason, let's just say your punishment wasn't something you'd recommend listening to before bed. Trials themselves were, let's call them, creative. In some places, there were trials by ordeal. The idea was simple: let God decide. You might be told to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a set number of steps. If your hand healed cleanly after a few days, you were innocent. If it got infected, guilty. Another method was trial by water. The accused would be thrown into a pond or river, hands tied. If you floated, that meant you were guilty because the pure water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, though unfortunately, you might drown in the process. Basically, heads I win, tails you lose. And then there were executions. These weren't private, behind-the-scenes events. Executions were entertainment. Whole towns would turn out to watch. It was part punishment, part public warning, part medieval theatre. Hanging was common for thieves and murderers. Nobles might be lucky enough to get beheaded, which was considered more dignified. Burnings at the stake were used for a heresy or witchcraft. And if the authorities wanted to make a real statement, there were methods even more gruesome, like drawing and quartering. I'll spare you the details, but trust me, it's exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. The church also had its own system of justice. Sins could be punished by penance, fines, or pilgrimages, but the church courts could also be harsh, especially when it came to heresy. People accused of spreading unapproved religious ideas risked torture and execution. Inquisitions weren't just rumors from history books, they were real. And they were terrifying. Not all punishments were bloody, though. Sometimes people were fined, especially for breaking local rules, like failing to maintain roads or letting animals wander. Other times, people had to do public penance, walking barefoot through town in a shameful outfit. And in rare cases, banishment was the punishment, which might sound like a lucky escape, until you realize being exiled from your village meant losing your home, protection, and community. Now, here is why you definitely wouldn't last a day under medieval justice. Imagine living in constant fear of making a mistake. Today, if you forget to pay a bill, you get a late fee. In the Middle Ages, if you couldn't pay your taxes to the Lord, soldiers might show up at your hut, seize your livestock, or toss you in a dungeon. Imagine if your Wi-Fi bill worked like that. And speaking of dungeons, yes, they existed, but not quite like the Hollywood version. Castles had underground holding cells, often damp, dark, and filled with rats. Prison wasn't usually the main punishment, it was too expensive to keep feeding people. But while you were awaiting trial or execution, you might find yourself chained to a wall in the dark. Not exactly a cozy Airbnb. One of the strangest parts of medieval justice was how uneven it was. Nobles often got lighter punishments, than peasants for the same crime. If you were rich, you might be able to pay a fine and walk away. If you were poor, you might lose your hand. Justice wasn't blind, it had very good eyesight, and it could tell exactly how much money you had in your purse. Now, to be fair, medieval people didn't invent cruelty for fun. Their justice system made sense in a world where law enforcement was limited and survival was tough. Public punishments worked as deterrents. Everyone seeing you in the stocks or hanging from a noose sent a clear message: don't try this yourself. It was brutal, yes, but effective in its own way. Still, from your modern perspective, it sounds horrifying. Imagine you're wrongly accused of something like stealing a chicken when in reality, it just wandered off. You could end up in the stocks, whipped, or worse, all because someone pointed a finger at you. Without modern evidence, DNA tests, or even decent record keeping, proving your innocence was nearly impossible. So, why wouldn't you last a day in this system? Because you're used to rights lawyers, appeals, innocent until proven guilty. In the Middle Ages, you were basically guilty until proven, well, lucky. And luck wasn't always on your side. Justice in the medieval world was raw, messy, and terrifying. It kept order, but at a cost. For peasants, it meant walking a fine line every single day. Work hard, obey your lord, don't step out of line. And maybe, just maybe, you'd avoid ending up in the stocks or worse. And yet, people still laughed, played, and lived their lives. Justice was brutal, but it was only one part of the medieval experience. The other part, the one we'll explore in the next chapter, was religion. Because if the lord of the manor didn't scare you into obedience, the fear of hellfire definitely would. Religion rules everything. If you thought medieval justice was harsh, wait until you see the power of medieval religion. Because in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just about what your local lord or king said, you also had to think about what God thought. And spoiler, God was believed to be watching everything. That loaf of bread you stole, sin. That mean thought about your neighbor, sign. That time you skipped church because you were too tired, double sign. Religion wasn't a Sunday-only activity. It was the center of life. From the moment you were born to the moment you died, the church had a role. Babies were baptized within days of birth, marriages were blessed by priests, and funerals were religious ceremonies. If you wanted to belong in society, you followed the church's rules. Let's start with the obvious. People went to church a lot. Every week for Mass, sure, but also for holy days, saints' days, feast days, and more. Some villages had small wooden churches, while cities had towering cathedrals with stained glass that looked like frozen rainbows. For peasants, stepping into a church was like stepping into another world, colorful, full of music, and way fancier than their smoky huts. But the church wasn't just about pretty buildings. It had real power. The Pope in Rome was considered God's representative on earth, and bishops and priests were his network of managers. If you disobeyed the church, you didn't just risk annoying your neighbors, you risked eternal damnation. People were taught that sin could land you in hell, and hell wasn't described as a fun place with Wi-Fi and air conditioning. No, it was eternal fire, demons, and suffering forever. That's a pretty strong motivator to behave. Because of this, confession was a big deal. People confessed their sins to priests, who assigned penance, maybe prayers, fasting, or a pilgrimage. Think of it as spiritual community service. And if you couldn't handle the idea of walking barefoot to a shrine, sometimes you could just pay for an indulgence, a piece of paper that promised to reduce your time in purgatory. Yes, even back then, people found ways to turn salvation into a business model. Pilgrimages were another huge part of religious life. People would travel long distances to visit holy sites, shrines, or relics. Relics were physical objects connected to saints' bones, clothing, or even pieces of the true cross. Owning or visiting relics was believed to bring blessings or healing. It sounds strange now, but back then, it was serious business. Some churches became wealthy because they claimed to have powerful relics, like the arm of a saint or a vial of holy blood. Whether or not the relics were real didn't matter, people believed, and that belief was powerful. Monasteries and convents were also important. Monks and nuns lived separate from the rest of society, dedicating their lives to prayer, study, and work. They copied manuscripts, preserved ancient texts, brewed beer, and offered charity to the poor. In a way, they were like medieval libraries mixed with soup kitchens. Without monasteries, a lot of classical knowledge would have been lost. Of course, religion wasn't all peaceful prayers and hymns. The church sometimes used its power harshly. Heresy, believing or teaching ideas different from church doctrine, was a dangerous accusation. Being labeled a heretic could get you excommunicated, kicked out of the church, which also meant being cut off from society or worse, burned at the stake. The Inquisition, especially later in the Middle Ages, hunted down people suspected of heresy with methods that were anything but gentle. Religion also influenced politics and war. Kings needed the blessing of the church to rule. Entire armies marched off to the Crusades because the Pope said it was God's will. The line between faith and politics was blurry at best. Even local disputes could involve the church, since priests and bishops often acted as judges or advisors. Daily life was shaped by faith too. The calendar revolved around religious festivals. Lent meant fasting, Advent meant preparing for Christmas, and countless saints' days sprinkled the year with special celebrations. For peasants, this was both a relief and a challenge. On the one hand, festivals broke up the monotony of work. On the other hand, fasting meant going without meat or dairy, which wasn't easy when your diet was already dull. Now, here is where you wouldn't last a day. Imagine living with constant guilt about every little action. Did you gossip about your neighbor? Sign. Did you oversleep and miss mass? Sign. Did you think bad thoughts while working in the field? Sign. Medieval people lived under a spiritual microscope, always worried about the state of their soul. You, on the other hand, would probably collapse under the pressure after about 3 hours. And then there's the fear. People truly believed hell was waiting for sinners, and purgatory was a miserable halfway stop. The thought of eternal suffering shaped their choices every single day. Compare that to your modern worries like running out of phone battery. It's safe to say medieval stress levels were on another level. But religion also gave people comfort. It offered hope, meaning, and a sense of community. Life in the Middle Ages was hard, and faith helped people cope with famine, disease, and loss. Singing hymns in church, praying for loved ones, or joining a pilgrimage gave people a way to connect to something bigger than themselves. So, while you might not last a day in this deeply religious world, medieval people couldn't imagine life without it. Faith guided their days, their choices, and their hopes for the future. Whether it was lighting a candle in a tiny village chapel or gazing up at the vaulted ceiling of a grand cathedral, religion was everywhere. And while faith offered structure and meaning, it didn't give you a break from hard labor, because in the next chapter, we're heading back to the fields, the workshops, and the grind of medieval work. Spoiler, you'll be clocking in at dawn and probably not clocking out until you drop. Work until you drop. So far, we've seen how religion ran people's lives, how justice made them tremble, and how entertainment gave them the occasional laugh. But now we return to the thing medieval folks did more than anything else: work. Endless, backbreaking, sunrise to sunset kind of work. Forget quiet quitting. In the Middle Ages, you couldn't quit, and quiet was only for the grave. Most people in medieval Europe were peasants, and peasants were tied to the land. If you were a serf, you technically weren't a slave, but you weren't free either. You couldn't pack up and move to a new town just because you didn't like your landlord. The land was your life, your prison, and your paycheck all at once. A peasant's daily grind was brutally simple. Wake up at dawn, sometimes earlier, say a quick prayer, and then start working in the fields. Depending on the season, you might be plowing, planting, weeding, or harvesting. Tools were basic wooden plows, sickles, scythes. No tractors, no gloves from the hardware store, and no ergonomic anything. Just you, your aching back, and the dirt. And this wasn't optional. Lords expected taxes and rents, which were often paid in crops, animals, or labor. On top of working your own little plot to feed your family, You had to work on the Lord's land for free a few days a week. It was called corps labor. And let's just say nobody lined up to volunteer. Now, maybe you're thinking, you'd just get a job in town. Fair enough, except medieval towns weren't exactly booming job markets. If you were lucky, you might join a trade like blacksmithing, weaving, or carpentry. Skilled trades were organized into guilds, basically medieval unions that controlled quality, prices, and training. But joining a guild wasn't easy. You had to spend years as an apprentice, often living in your master's house, working long hours for little or no pay. Then, if you proved yourself, you could become a journeyman, and maybe, one day, after decades of hard work, you could become a master and open your own shop. But by then, your back would be permanently bent, and your hairline would probably have receded to the back of your head. Women worked just as hard, if not harder. Peasant women didn't just cook and raise children, they helped in the fields, tended animals, spun wool, brewed ale, and fetched water from wells or rivers. A woman's day off usually meant she had slightly fewer chores than usual, but let's be honest, there was no day off. Children weren't spared either. From a young age, kids helped with herding, carrying water, or gathering firewood. Childhood wasn't about cartoons and playgrounds, it was about being a tiny, unpaid assistant to your exhausted parents. And let's not forget the jobs nobody wanted, but somebody had to do. Tanners, who worked with animal hides, smelled terrible because of the chemicals they used. Butchers dealt with gore every day. Gong farmers, yes. That's the technical term, cleaned out cesspits full of human waste. Imagine coming home from work smelling like that. No amount of medieval perfume, which was usually just more herbs, could fix it. Life for the nobility wasn't exactly lounging on silk cushions either. Sure, lords didn't plough fields, but managing an estate was no small task. They had to collect rents, organize labor, and provide soldiers when the king called. Noble women oversaw households, which included dozens of servants and workers. Running a castle was like managing a medieval hotel crossed with a farm, and it was constant work. Now, why wouldn't you last a day in this world of work? Because your modern idea of hard work involves air conditioning, coffee breaks, and maybe some ergonomic furniture. In the Middle Ages, there was none of that. Your break was collapsing on a wooden bench for 10 minutes before heading back out into the fields. If you got sick or injured, too bad, you still had to work, or your family might starve. There was no health insurance, no workers' comp, and certainly no mental health day. And the hours, forget 9 to 5. Medieval peasants worked from dawn until dusk, especially during planting and harvest seasons. In summer, that could mean 14 or more hours in the fields. Winter was a little easier, but then you were busy repairing tools, mending clothes, and trying not to freeze to death. It's not that medieval people never rested. Religious festivals gave them days off, and Sundays were supposed to be work-free. But those days were still filled with chores, like tending animals or repairing roofs. And festivals, while fun, were often physically demanding, to dancing, feasting, or walking miles to visit a shrine. Not exactly the same as spending Sunday binge-watching your favorite show. Even the tools of the trade would make you wince. Imagine swinging a scythe for hours without gloves, cutting your hands on rough wood handles. Imagine hauling buckets of water until your shoulders ached, or grinding grain by hand until your arms felt like jelly. Every task was manual, heavy, and exhausting, and yet medieval people managed. They were tougher, more resilient, and used to discomfort in ways you probably aren't. They didn't complain about missing Wi-Fi because they didn't know it existed. They worried about blisters, broken plows, and whether the harvest would be good enough to survive the winter. So, yes, work in the Middle Ages was relentless. It shaped every day, every season, every life. You wouldn't last a day, but medieval folks lasted lifetimes. Not because they had a choice, but because survival demanded it. But work wasn't the only danger. Even if you did your job perfectly, life could still throw chaos at you in the form of war. Because while you were busy planting crops, someone else might be busy marching an army straight through your village. And that's where we're headed next, the world of medieval wars and raids, where peace was always temporary and survival was never guaranteed. Wars and raids life in the Middle Ages was already hard enough: food shortages, endless work, and questionable hygiene. But just when you thought things couldn't get worse, someone would come along with an army and prove you wrong. Because medieval Europe was not exactly a peaceful place. Wars, raids, and feuds were constant, and unless you lived in the most remote backwater village, you were always at risk of getting caught up in the chaos. Let's start with the big picture. Kings and nobles were constantly fighting over land, power, or insults that seem petty by modern standards. He looked at me funny could easily escalate into a border war. Dynasties clashed, families feuded, and alliances fell apart faster than a medieval wooden cart. The average peasant didn't have much say in these conflicts, but they paid the price. Armies marched across fields, trampling crops and stealing livestock. Soldiers foraged, which is a polite way of saying they looted villages for food and supplies. If your village happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could lose everything overnight. And then there were raids. Early in the medieval period, Viking raids terrified coastal and river settlements. Longships appeared out of nowhere, warriors stormed ashore, and by the time the smoke cleared, half the village was gone. Even after the Viking Age ended, raids by rival lords or mercenaries were still common. Safety was always temporary. If you were a peasant, defending yourself wasn't really an option. Sure, you might grab a pitchfork or a club, but against armored knights on horseback, good luck. Your best bet was to run, hide in the woods, or pray your lord's castle was close enough to shelter you. Castles weren't built just for show, they were fortresses designed to protect the local population during times of war. Of course, getting inside one depended on whether the gates were open when you arrived. Speaking of castles, siege warfare was a whole other nightmare. If your lord's castle was attacked, life inside turned grim fast. Picture hundreds of people crammed together, running low on food and water, while enemies outside fired rocks, flaming arrows, or worse with catapults and trebuchets. Some attackers even hurled dead animals over the walls to spread disease. Not exactly the kind of room service anyone wanted. And then there were the battles themselves. Forget the polished jousts at tournaments, real battles were chaotic, bloody, and terrifying. Knights charged on horseback, infantry clashed with spears, arrows rained down from above. The noise, the confusion, the stench, it was overwhelming. Medieval warfare wasn't elegant, it was survival of the toughest. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but he'd just become a knight. Problem solved. Sorry, but no. Becoming a knight required years of expensive training, starting as a page, then a squire, before you even touched a lance in battle. And even if you made it, knights weren't invincible. They could be unhorsed, captured, or killed like anyone else. Plus, armor was heavy, and wearing it all day was exhausting. It looked cool, sure, but after a few hours, you'd be sweating like you just ran a marathon in a sauna. Peasants were sometimes dragged into armies, too. Lords called up their tenants to serve as foot soldiers. Imagine being handed a spear, told to stand in a line, and then pushed toward an enemy army. No training, no choice, no thanks. Many peasants died in these conscripted forces, often without even knowing what the war was about. And wars weren't just about land. Religion also fueled conflicts, like the Crusades. Thousands of Europeans marched to the Holy Land after the Pope promised forgiveness of sins for those who joined. Some went out of faith, others for wealth or adventure, but the result was centuries of bloody battles far from home. Why wouldn't you last a day in this world of constant conflict? Because you're used to peace being the default. In the Middle Ages, peace was temporary, fragile, and rare. The thought of waking up to find your village on fire wasn't just a nightmare, it was a real possibility. You'd spend your days not just working and surviving, but always keeping one eye on the horizon, wondering if today was the day trouble arrived. And let's not forget the aftermath. Even if you weren't killed in a raid or a battle, war left scars. Fields destroyed meant famine. Families torn apart meant grief. Survivors carried trauma we'd now call PTSD, though back then it was just another part of life. So, no matter where you lived, war was always a shadow in the background. Whether it was a Viking longship on the horizon, a band of mercenaries passing through, or a full-scale battle between rival kings, the threat never went away. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't just about surviving the day, it was about surviving the wars that kept reshaping the world around you. Still, not everyone lived in fear every day. Nobles, for example, were at the center of this violent world, but their lives weren't all battles and bloodshed. They had luxuries, politics, and family drama that could rival any modern soap opera. Which brings us to the next chapter, the glamour and the not-so-glamorous reality of noble life. The glamour of nobility, really so far. We've trudged through muddy fields, survived plagues, and dodged arrows. You might be thinking, well, at least the nobles had it good. Castles, feasts, servants. It sounds like the medieval version of luxury living. But here is the truth. Noble life wasn't as glamorous as it looks in storybooks. Sure, they had fancier clothes and better food than peasants, but it came with strings attached, big, heavy, political, dangerous strings. Let's start with the castles. On the outside, castles look impressive, massive stone walls, towers reaching for the sky, banners flapping in the wind. On the inside, drafty, damp, and dark. Heating a stone fortress wasn't easy. Fireplaces kept one room warm, maybe two, while the rest of the place felt like a fridge. Add in smoke, rats, and the constant smell of burning tallow candles, and suddenly your luxury home feels less like a palace and more like a medieval Airbnb gone wrong. Food was better for nobles, no doubt. They had meat more often, spices imported from faraway lands, and banquets with endless courses. But even feasts weren't all fun. They could drag on 4 hours, with long speeches, strict etiquette, and the pressure to show off wealth. And while eating peacock roasted in its feathers might impress the guests, I can promise you it didn't taste like chicken. Clothing was fancier too, with silk, velvet, and bright dyes that peasants couldn't afford. But fashion came with rules. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Based on rank, wear something above your station, and you could face fines. Nobles might have looked elegant, but their wardrobes were more about showing status than comfort. Imagine living in stiff, itchy clothes every day just to prove you were rich. No sweatpants, no pajamas ever. Now, about the work of being noble. Yes, they didn't labor in the fields, but they weren't lounging around either. Lords managed estates, collected rents, and dispensed justice to their tenants. They had to organize defenses, supply soldiers to the king, and negotiate with other nobles. It was like running a business, a farm, and a military unit all at once. And if they failed, they could lose everything. For noble women, life was equally demanding. They oversaw households, which could mean dozens or even hundreds of servants and workers. They arranged marriages, managed finances when their husbands were away, and sometimes even defended castles during sieges. Forget the fairy tale princess waiting in a tower. Real noble women worked hard to keep everything running. Politics made noble life downright dangerous. Alliances shifted constantly, and betrayal was common. A feast could turn into a trap, a handshake into a declaration of war. Nobles might marry for power, but those marriages came with drama worthy of a modern soap opera. Your spouse might be a stranger, your in-laws might be enemies, and your life could depend on choosing the right side in the next conflict. And then there was the ever-present risk of war. Nobles were expected to lead troops into battle, whether they wanted to or not. Sure, knights looked heroic charging with lances, but death didn't care if you had a title. One unlucky arrow, one misplaced step, and you were just another casualty. Even surviving battle didn't guarantee peace. You might be captured and ransomed, or crippled for life. Disease didn't spare the nobility either. Castles weren't immune to plague, dysentery, or smallpox. In fact, large households made spreading illness easier. All the silk in the world couldn't keep fleas away, and rats didn't respect titles. When the Black Death swept across Europe, It killed peasants and nobles alike. So why wouldn't you last a day in noble life? Because while it looks glamorous on the surface, it was stressful, political, and often terrifying. Imagine living every day knowing that one wrong word, one failed alliance, or one lost battle could destroy your family's fortunes. It's not exactly the kind of pressure you'd want when you're already stressed about replying to emails on time. Of course, nobles had advantages peasants didn't: more food, better clothes, education, and influence. But those perks came with responsibilities that could crush you. Being noble meant living in a spotlight where every move mattered. If you slipped up, people noticed, and rivals took advantage. So, while you might survive a little longer in a castle than in a smoky peasant hut, noble life wasn't the dream you think it was. It was cold, uncomfortable, and filled with danger just dressed up in velvet. And that brings us to our grand finale. We've toured medieval life from food to fashion, from justice to war. Now it's time to tie it all together in the final chapter, where we ask the big question. After everything you've seen, why exactly wouldn't you last a single day in medieval times? Why you wouldn't last a day? So here we are. After wandering through muddy fields, coughing our way through plague towns, dodging arrows in battles, and peeking into drafty castles, we've finally reached the end. And now it's time to answer the big question. Why exactly wouldn't you last a single day in medieval times? Let's start with the obvious. Comfort. You live in a world with soft beds, indoor plumbing, central heating, and pizza delivery. The Middle Ages had straw mattresses filled with bugs, wooden buckets for bathrooms, smoky fires that only warmed one room, and bread so hard you could break your teeth on it. Even if you somehow made it through a day without starving, getting sick, or being robbed, you'd still be miserable from the sheer lack of basic comforts. Then there's hygiene, or really, the lack of it. Forget hot showers and toothpaste. In the medieval world, washing was rare, soap was basic, and people thought bathing too much could make you sick. Your clothes, probably the same outfit you wore yesterday, and the day before and the week before. Add in chamber pots, mud-covered streets, and livestock wandering through town, and you'd be wishing for the sweet scent of modern garbage day. Work would break you. Medieval peasants spent dawn to dusk in the fields, bending, digging, planting, and harvesting with tools that barely got the job done. No tractors, no machines, no shortcuts. And remember, this was year-round survival work, not a job you clock out of. Miss a harvest, and you didn't just lose money, you starved. Modern desk jobs might feel boring, but at least they don't leave you with blisters the size of grapes and a back that feels 80 years old by the time you're 20. Food wasn't great either. Forget burgers, fries, and ice cream. Peasant meals were mostly bread, porridge, and maybe vegetables. Meat was rare, sugar was a luxury, and spices were so expensive they might as well have been made of gold. Even nobles, who ate better, had questionable menus. Picture dishes like boiled eels, jellied fish, or meat pies seasoned with more pepper than actual flavor. And without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Yum. Then there's health. Even a small cut could kill you. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no modern medicine. Doctors relied on superstition and theories about balancing your body's humors. Basically, they thought being sick, you had too much blood or bile. Their solution: leeches, lots of leeches. Surviving a medieval doctor was almost harder than surviving the disease itself. And don't forget danger. Wars, raids, bandits, and feuds could turn your world upside down in a heartbeat. You might wake up to find your village burning, your crops stolen, or your lord demanding you march into battle with nothing but a spear. Peace wasn't the norm, it was a lucky break between disasters. Even if you tried to avoid trouble, society itself could trap you. Most people were born into their roles and stayed there. If you were a peasant, chances were you'd stay a peasant your whole life. Social mobility wasn't exactly booming, and if you broke the rules, the justice system was brutal. Forget fair trials, punishments were harsh, public, and often deadly. Let's not sugarcoat it, life expectancy was short. Many children never made it past age 5. If you survived childhood, you could still die young from disease, famine, or injury. Living past 40 was almost an achievement. Compare that to today, when people complain about turning 30 as if it's the end of the world. So why wouldn't you last a day? Because modern life has spoiled you in the best way. You're used to safety, medicine, technology, and food variety that medieval people couldn't even dream of. You expect electricity, running water, and Wi-Fi. In medieval times, even kings didn't have those. But here is the thing, medieval people did last. They endured it all because they had to. They were tougher, more resilient, and far more resourceful than most of us today. What feels impossible to you was simply normal life for them. They worked, prayed, fought, and survived in a world that was brutal, but also full of meaning, tradition, and community. And maybe that's the real lesson here. You wouldn't last a day because you weren't born into that world, you weren't shaped by it. Just as a medieval peasant wouldn't last a day in the modern world of traffic jams, credit cards, and smartphones. Each age makes its own survivors. So, next time you're annoyed about slow Wi-Fi, remember, at least you're not trudging through a muddy field in the rain, eating cold porridge, and hoping raiders don't burn your house down tonight. Congratulations, you've survived this journey through medieval life. No plagues, no pitchforks, no angry knights chasing you down. Just a new appreciation for how lucky you are to live in a world where your biggest medieval problem is deciding which history documentary to fall asleep to.